Ruby lips and emerald eyes drew every man's stare in the smoky saloon, but Violet Crawford knew she was nothing but a ghost behind the makeup. Trapped in a life she'd never chosen, in a town where she'd become just another pretty face to be bought and sold. She yearned for anything other than the stale beer and wandering hands. She endured every night at the Silver Dollar Saloon in La Veta, Colorado, in the spring of 1876. "Another round for the gentleman at table 3, Violet," barked Horace Wilkins, the portly owner who wore his wealth in gold rings and watched his investments, as he called his girls with the sharp eyes of a hawk. "Yes, Mr. Wilkins," she replied, gathering the glasses onto her tray, careful not to spill a drop. Every mistake meant a deduction from her already meager earnings. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she navigated through the crowded tables. La Veta had once been a sleepy town nestled at the foot of the Spanish Peaks, but the discovery of coal in the nearby mountains had transformed it into a bustling hub of miners, cowboys, and the occasional gentleman from back east seeking fortune in the frontier. Violet had arrived 3 years ago at 19, naive and desperate after her parents' farm had been foreclosed following her father's sudden death. With nothing but a small bag of possessions and her mother's locket around her neck, she had taken the only job available to a young woman alone in the West. What had begun as serving drinks had slowly evolved into expectations of more, and though she'd managed to avoid the worst of it, she knew her time was running short. As she set the drinks down before the rough-looking miners, one of them caught her wrist, his calloused fingers digging into her skin. "Why don't you sit with us a while, pretty lady?" His breath reeked of whiskey and chewing tobacco. "I'm afraid Mr. Wilkins needs me serving, sir," she replied with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Perhaps another time." The man reluctantly released her, but not before sliding his hand up her arm in a gesture that made her skin crawl. This was her existence now, a constant dance of deflection and false promises, while trying to maintain some shred of dignity. The saloon doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of evening air that momentarily cleared the haze of tobacco smoke. In stepped a man Violet hadn't seen before, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dust-covered Stetson and a weathered leather vest. Unlike the boisterous miners or preening businessmen, he moved with a quiet confidence that drew her attention. He took a seat at a corner table, removed his hat, and ran a hand through his sandy brown hair. When he looked up, their eyes met briefly across the room, his a deep, stormy blue that seemed to take her measure in an instant before he politely nodded and looked away. "Violet." Wilkins's voice shattered the moment. "Table 6 needs attention, girl. Stop daydreaming." She hurried to the new customer, notepad in hand. "What can I get for you, sir?" "Just water for now, madam," he replied, his voice low and measured with a slight Texan drawl. "Been riding since dawn." "No whiskey. You might be the first man to order water in the Silver Dollar," she said, allowing herself a genuine smile. "Well, I find a clear head serves me better than a clouded one," he replied. "The name's Thomas Jennings. Just arrived in town looking for work." "Violet Crawford," she offered, then caught herself being too familiar. Wilkins didn't approve of his girls making conversation beyond what was necessary to encourage drinking. "I'll fetch your water right away, Mr. Jennings." As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Miss Crawford, would you happen to know if anyone around here is hiring ranch hands? I've got experience with cattle and horses. The Davidson Ranch about 5 miles west might be," she said. "Mr. Davidson mentioned needing help with his spring cattle drive." Thomas nodded in thanks, and Violet returned to the bar, feeling Wilkins's disapproving gaze on her back. The night wore on, growing increasingly rowdy as more miners filtered in from the evening shift. A piano player hammered out tinny tunes while card games intensified in the corner. Violet moved mechanically through her duties, her mind drifting to the letter she'd received that morning from Mrs. Holloway, the landlady of the boarding house where she rented a small room. The rent was increasing again, and with what Wilkins paid her after taking his cut for board and protection, she wouldn't be able to afford it. The alternatives were moving into the rooms above the saloon where some of the other girls stayed, which would give Wilkins even more control over her life, or accepting the additional duties he'd been pressuring her to take on with preferred customers. Near midnight, as she collected empty glasses from an abandoned table, a scuffle broke out at the bar. One of the miners, clearly deep in his cups, had taken offense at something said by a companion. Before anyone could intervene, he had smashed a bottle and was brandishing the jagged edge. "You calling me a liar, Peterson?" he slurred, waving the makeshift weapon dangerously. Violet stepped back, her heart racing as the other patrons scrambled away from the confrontation. Wilkins was shouting ineffectually from behind the bar, but the drunk miner paid no attention, his rage focused entirely on his now frightened companion. As the miner lunged forward, a hand shot out, catching his wrist in mid-strike. Thomas Jennings had moved with surprising speed from his corner table and now stood between the two miners, his grip firm on the armed man's wrist. "That's enough," he said calmly. "Why don't you put that down before someone gets hurt?" The miner struggled briefly, but found his wrist immobilized in Thomas's grip. After a tense moment, the fight seemed to drain out of him, and Thomas carefully relieved him of the broken bottle. "I think you've had enough for tonight, friend," Thomas said, nodding to two of the man's companions who had finally gathered their wits. "Your buddies can get you home." The miners grumbled but led their drunken friend toward the door. As they passed Violet, the armed man suddenly lashed out, shoving her hard against a nearby table. She cried out as she fell, glasses crashing to the floor around her. Thomas was there in an instant, helping her to her feet while fixing the retreating miners with a steely gaze that stopped them in their tracks. "Apologize to the lady," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable command. "She's just a saloon girl," one of them muttered. Thomas took a step forward. "I said, apologize to the lady." Something in his demeanor must have convinced them, as the drunk miner mumbled an apology before being hustled out by his friends. "Are you all right, Miss Crawford?" Thomas asked, his concern appearing genuine as he steadied her. "Yes, thank you," she replied, embarrassed by the scene and already anticipating Wilkins's reaction to the broken glassware. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine," he observed, noticing her wince as she moved her wrist where she'd caught herself in the fall. Before she could respond, Wilkins appeared beside them, his face flushed with anger. "Look at this mess," he exploded. "That's coming out of your pay, Violet, and who's going to serve tables while you're standing here chatting?" Thomas turned to the saloon owner. "Sir, the lady was just shoved to the ground. Perhaps she needs a moment." "She's not a lady, she's an employee," Wilkins retorted, "and I don't recall asking for your opinion, stranger." Violet saw Thomas's jaw tighten, but he maintained his composure. "My apologies," he said, though his tone suggested he was anything but sorry. "I'll help clean this up since I was involved in the altercation." "Don't bother," Wilkins snapped. "Violet knows how to clean up after herself, don't you, girl?" He grabbed her arm, pulling her away from Thomas. "Get the broom from the back and take care of this, then finish your shift. And remember what I said about entertaining other options if you're short on rent money." The implication wasn't lost on Thomas, whose expression darkened, but Violet gave a slight shake of her head, silently asking him not to make things worse. She hurried to fetch the broom, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The rest of the night passed in a blur of drinks served, and unwanted advances deflected. Thomas remained at his table, nursing a single whiskey he'd finally ordered, his eyes occasionally finding hers across the room with a look that was neither lecherous nor pitying, but something she couldn't quite define. As the saloon finally emptied in the early hours of the morning, Violet began the nightly cleaning routine, her body aching with fatigue. Wilkins counted the till behind the bar, occasionally casting disapproving glances her way. "You cost me money tonight with that little scene," he said as she wiped down the last table. "Those miners might not come back." "I'm sorry, Mr. Wilkins," she replied automatically. "It won't happen again. See that it doesn't," he warned. "And remember, your rent situation isn't my problem. But I've got a gentleman, a businessman from Denver who's been asking about you. Very generous he is. Could solve all your financial troubles with one night." Violet gripped the rag tightly, her knuckles turning white. "I'll figure something out, Mr. Wilkins." "You do that," he said dismissively. "Lock up when you're done, and Violet—" His voice took on a harder edge. "I can't keep a girl who only serves drinks, not profitable enough. You understand?" With that final threat hanging in the air, he left, the door slamming behind him. Violet leaned against the bar, fighting back tears of frustration. She had exactly 3 days to come up with rent money before Mrs. Holloway would evict her, and nowhere near enough saved. The gentleman from Denver loomed as an increasingly inevitable fate. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear the door open again. When she looked up, Thomas Jennings stood just inside the entrance, his hat in his hands. "My apologies, Miss Crawford," he said. "I thought you might still be here. I realized I forgot to pay my bill in all the commotion." Violet straightened up, quickly wiping her eyes. "That's all right, Mr. Jennings. It's just a whiskey and water." He approached the bar, placing several coins on the counter, far more than his drinks had cost. When she began to reach for change, he shook his head. "Keep it," he said. "For the trouble earlier." "That wasn't your fault," she protested, "and this is too much. Consider it a tip, then." He paused, studying her face. "Are you all right? Truly?" The simple question, asked with genuine concern, nearly broke her composure. How long had it been since anyone had asked how she was and actually waited for a real answer? "I'm fine," she said automatically, then amended. "No, that's not true. I'm not fine at all, but it's nothing you need concern yourself with, Mr. Jennings." Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand. We all have our burdens." He put his hat back on, tipping it slightly. "Good night, Miss Crawford. Thank you for the information about the Davidson Ranch. I'll be heading there tomorrow." As he turned to leave, Violet found herself speaking without thinking. "Mr. Jennings, thank you for what you did tonight, standing up for me like that. Most men wouldn't bother." He looked back at her, a small smile crossing his face. "My pa always said the measure of a man isn't how he treats his equals, but those society tells him he can ignore." With a final nod, he stepped out into the night. Violet finished cleaning in silence, her mind churning with desperate thoughts of escape. As she locked the saloon doors and stepped into the cool night air, she made a decision. She couldn't stay in La Veta any longer. She didn't know where she would go or how she would survive, but anything seemed better than the path Wilkins had laid out for her. With determination born of desperation, she walked quickly toward her boarding house, planning to gather what few possessions she had and leave before dawn. She had $18 saved, not enough for a train ticket to anywhere significant, but perhaps enough to get her started somewhere new, somewhere she could remake herself into something more than just a saloon girl. The streets of La Veta were silent and dark, with only the occasional oil lamp illuminating her path. As she rounded the corner onto Maple Street, where her boarding house stood, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead, causing her to freeze in momentary fear. "Well, well," came a slurred voice she recognized with dread. It was Edgar Simmons, one of the miners who had been in the saloon earlier, a persistent and unwelcome admirer who had made his intentions clear on numerous occasions. "Fancy meeting you here, Violet." "Excuse me, Mr. Simmons," she said firmly, attempting to walk past him. "It's late and I'm tired." He stepped into her path, blocking her way. "Now, don't be like that. I've been patient, haven't I? Spending good money at that saloon just to see you." His hand reached out, grabbing her arm. "I think it's time you showed some appreciation." Violet tried to pull away, her heart pounding with fear. "Let go of me, Mr. Simmons. Now." "Or what?" he sneered, his grip tightening painfully. "Going to call for help? No one around to hear you, darling." As she opened her mouth to scream, another voice cut through the night. "I believe the lady asked you to let her go." Thomas Jennings stood a few yards away, his stance relaxed but his eyes hard in the moonlight. Simmons turned, keeping his grip on Violet's arm. "This ain't your business, stranger. This is between me and her." "I'm making it my business," Thomas replied, taking a step forward. "Now let her go and we can all go our separate ways without trouble." "You threatening me?" Simmons demanded, his free hand moving to his belt where Violet knew he carried a knife. Thomas sighed, as if disappointed. "No, sir, just stating a fact. You're going to let go of Miss Crawford one way or another." Something in his tone must have penetrated Simmons's alcohol-fogged brain, because after a moment of tense silence, he released Violet's arm with a shove. "She ain't worth the trouble anyway," he muttered, staggering past Thomas with a wide berth. Thomas waited until Simmons had disappeared around the corner before approaching Violet. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said, rubbing her arm where Simmons's fingers had dug in. "Thank you, again." She looked at him curiously. "Why are you still out this late?" "I was heading to the livery where I left my horse," he explained, "planning to sleep there tonight before riding out to the Davidson Ranch tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "I'm glad I was passing by when I did." "So am I," Violet admitted. She glanced toward her boarding house, then back at Thomas, making a split-second decision. "Mr. Jennings, may I speak frankly with you?" "Of course." "I'm leaving La Veta tonight," she said, her voice steady despite the fear churning inside her. "I can't stay here any longer. What Mr. Wilkins expects of me. I won't do it, but I have nowhere to go and very little money." Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she continued, embarrassed now. "It's not your problem, I suppose I wanted someone to know I was going, even if we're strangers." "Where will you go?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," she admitted. "Denver, maybe, or Pueblo, somewhere I can find decent work." Thomas removed his hat, running a hand through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a habit when he was thinking. "Miss Crawford, I hope you won't take this the wrong way, but traveling alone as a woman in this territory is dangerous, especially with limited funds." "I know," she said, lifting her chin. "But staying here is dangerous in a different way." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "What if I proposed an alternative?" Violet tensed, immediately suspicious. She'd heard too many alternatives from men before. Seeing her reaction, Thomas quickly continued, "I'm heading to the Davidson Ranch tomorrow to seek work. If they hire me, I'll need someone to cook and keep house at whatever lodging they provide. It would be honest work, Miss Crawford. Paid work." She studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. "Why would you do that for me? You don't know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you're in trouble and trying to make an honest way for yourself. My mother raised me to help those in need when I can." He paused. "There would be no expectations, if that's your concern. Just work and a safe place to stay until you decide what you want to do next." The offer was unexpected and almost too good to be true. But when Violet looked into Thomas's steady blue eyes, she saw nothing but sincerity. "What if they don't hire you?" she asked. "Then we'll figure something else out," he promised. "But Mr. Davidson needs hands, according to what you told me, and I'm good with cattle. I've been working ranches since I was 15. Violet took a deep breath, weighing her limited options. Leave tonight with no plan and little money, facing unknown dangers on the road, or take a chance on this stranger who had already shown her more kindness than most. "All right, Mr. Jennings," she finally said. "I accept your offer, provided Mr. Davidson hires you." Relief crossed his face. "Good. Meet me at the livery at dawn. Bring whatever you can carry. We'll ride out to the ranch together." "I'll be there," she promised. "And thank you." He nodded once, replaced his hat, and with a final "good night, Miss Crawford," continued on his way toward the livery stable. Violet watched him go, hardly daring to believe the turn her fortune had taken. There was still much uncertainty ahead, but for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. She hurried to her boarding house, slipping quietly inside and up to her small room. There, she began gathering her few possessions, 2 dresses besides the one she wore, undergarments, a brush, her mother's locket, and the small Bible that had been her father's. Everything fit into a single carpet bag with room to spare, a testament to how little she had accumulated in her 3 years in La Veta. Violet lay down on her narrow bed, but didn't sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts of the day ahead and the man who had unexpectedly offered her a chance at escape. Thomas Jennings was unlike any man she'd met in La Veta, perhaps unlike any man she'd ever known. There was a quietness to him, a steadiness that seemed out of place in the rough and tumble world of the frontier. She wondered what had brought him to Colorado, what story lay behind those perceptive blue eyes. But most of all, she wondered if she was making the right decision in trusting him. Her experiences had taught her to be wary of men's motivations, yet something told her Thomas was different. As the first light of dawn began to filter through her window, Violet rose, changed into her sturdiest dress, a simple brown cotton with modest trim, and picked up her carpet bag. She left the key to her room on the table along with a brief note for Mrs. Holloway, explaining she had found employment elsewhere and would not be returning. The streets were quiet as she made her way to the livery stable, the town still slumbering except for a few early risers. When she arrived, Thomas was already there, saddling a sturdy chestnut gelding. He looked up as she approached, offering a small smile. "Good morning, Miss Crawford. Ready to go?" "Yes," she said, hefting her bag. "This is everything." Thomas nodded, taking the bag from her and securing it to his saddle. "I hope you don't mind riding double. It's only about an hour to the Davidson ranch." "I don't mind," she assured him, though in truth, the prospect of such close proximity to a man she barely knew made her nervous. As if sensing her discomfort, Thomas said, "I can walk alongside if you prefer to ride alone." "No," she said quickly. "That would be silly. It's been a long time since I've been on a horse," he nodded, understanding. "I'll help you up then." With practiced ease, he mounted first, then extended a hand to her. Violet hesitated only briefly before taking it, allowing him to pull her up behind him. She settled awkwardly, unsure where to place her hands. "You'll need to hold on," he said gently. "It's all right." Taking a deep breath, Violet placed her hands lightly on his sides. As the horse began to move, however, she quickly tightened her grip, the unfamiliar sensation of being on horseback after so many years making her instinctively press closer for security. They rode out of La Veta as the town was beginning to stir, a few early workers casting curious glances their way. Violet kept her head down, not wanting to be recognized. The last thing she needed was for Wilkins to hear of her departure before she was safely away. Once they had left the town behind, riding west along a well-traveled dirt road, Violet began to relax slightly. The morning was beautiful, the spring air crisp and fragrant with wildflowers. The Spanish peaks loomed majestically in the distance, their snow-capped summits gleaming in the early sunlight. "It's a beautiful country," Thomas remarked after they had ridden in silence for some time. "Yes," Violet agreed. "I had forgotten how beautiful it could be." "You haven't been outside of La Veta much," Not in years, she admitted. Mr. Wilkins didn't give us many days off, and when he did, I usually spent them sleeping. Thomas nodded, understanding in his silence. After another moment, he asked, "Have you always lived in Colorado?" "No," she said, grateful for the neutral conversation topic. "I grew up in Missouri. My parents had a small farm there. After my father died, the bank foreclosed, and my mother and I had nowhere to go. She had a cousin in Denver who offered to take us in, so we came west." The familiar pain of loss washed over her. "My mother didn't survive the journey, pneumonia. I arrived in Denver alone." "I'm sorry," Thomas said softly. "Losing family is never easy." "What about you?" she asked, wanting to shift the focus away from her grief. "Where are you from, Mr. Jennings?" "Texas, originally," he replied. "Near San Antonio. My father ran cattle there until the war. After that, things changed. He never recovered from his wounds and we lost the ranch. I've been working my way across the West since I was 15, hiring on with cattle drives and ranches." "No family waiting for you somewhere," she ventured. There was a slight pause before he answered. "No, not anymore." Something in his tone suggested a story there, but Violet didn't press. Everyone had their sorrows, and some weren't meant to be shared with near strangers. The landscape changed as they rode, transitioning from the open prairie near Lavetta to rolling foothills dotted with pine and aspen. Finally, Thomas pointed ahead to where a collection of buildings came into view. "That's the Davidson place," he said. "One of the largest cattle operations in this part of Colorado, from what I've heard." The ranch was impressive, with a substantial main house built of sturdy logs, several outbuildings, a large barn, and extensive corrals. As they approached, men could be seen working with cattle in the distance, while smoke rose from the chimney of the main house. Thomas guided his horse up to a hitching post near the house and dismounted before helping Violet down. Her legs were stiff from the unaccustomed ride, and she stumbled slightly as her feet hit the ground, Thomas's hand steadying her briefly before he stepped back. "Wait here," he said. "I'll speak to Mr. Davidson about work." Violet nodded, suddenly nervous. What if there was no job? What if Mr. Davidson didn't want a former saloon girl on his property? What if her spiraling thoughts were interrupted by the front door opening? A man in his 50s emerged, his weathered face creased with lines of both laughter and hardship. He was followed by a woman of similar age, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Morning," the man said, his eyes moving from Thomas to Violet with open curiosity. "What can I do for you folks?" "Good morning, sir," Thomas replied, removing his hat respectfully. "Are you Mr. Davidson? I heard in town you might be hiring for the spring drive." "That's right," Davidson confirmed, his gaze assessing Thomas. "You have experience." "Yes, sir. I've been working cattle since I could walk. Most recently with the Bar X outfit in Wyoming, but I've driven herds from Texas to Montana." Davidson nodded, seemingly impressed. "We're short-handed, that's for sure. Lost 2 men to mining claims and another headed back east to get married." His eyes shifted to Violet. "And the lady?" Thomas glanced at Violet, a silent question in his eyes. She stepped forward, deciding to speak for herself. "My name is Violet Crawford, sir," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I was hoping you might need someone to cook or clean. I'm a hard worker. Mrs. Davidson stepped forward, her kind face showing interest. "As a matter of fact, we do. Our last housekeeper left to join her daughter in Pueblo 2 months ago. I've been managing alone, but with the spring drive coming and extra hands to feed, I could certainly use the help." She looked at her husband. "What do you think, Robert?" Davidson stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Are you two married?" he asked bluntly. "No, sir," Thomas answered quickly. "Miss Crawford is a friend in need of honest work, as am I." Davidson exchanged a look with his wife, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Well, I don't typically hire unmarried women to live on the property, he began. Violet's heart sank, but before she could speak, Mrs. Davidson interjected, "Robert, the girl needs work and I need help. She can stay in the small room off the kitchen and I'll vouch for her character." She turned to Violet with a kind smile. "Forgive my husband. He's old-fashioned but fair." Davidson sighed, clearly accustomed to deferring to his wife in such matters. "Very well, Martha. If you're satisfied, so am I." He turned to Thomas. "As for you, Jennings, I can offer $2 a day plus room and board in the bunkhouse. The spring drive to the railhead in Pueblo starts in 3 weeks. If you work out, there could be permanent employment afterward." "Thank you, sir," Thomas said, relief evident in his voice. "I appreciate the opportunity." "And for you, Miss Crawford," Mrs. Davidson said, "I can offer $1 a day plus room and board. Your duties would include helping with cooking, cleaning, laundry, and whatever else needs doing around the house." It was more than Violet had ever made at the saloon after Wilkins took his cut. "Thank you, Mrs. Davidson. I accept gratefully." "Good," Davidson said with a nod. "Jennings, you can get settled in the bunkhouse. Foreman's name is Hank Miller. Tell him I sent you and he'll show you the ropes." He looked at his wife. "Martha, can you get Miss Crawford situated?" "Of course," Mrs. Davidson replied. "Come with me, dear. You must be tired after your journey." As Violet moved to follow Mrs. Davidson, she caught Thomas's eye. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. He nodded once, a small smile crossing his features before he turned to lead his horse toward the barn, following Davidson. Mrs. Davidson led Violet into a spacious, well-appointed home that spoke of prosperity earned through hard work. The kitchen was large and modern by frontier standards, with a cast-iron stove, a pump for water, and ample work surfaces. Beyond it was a small but neat room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a simple chest of drawers. "This will be your room," Mrs. Davidson explained. "It's not much, but it's private." "It's perfect," Violet said honestly, setting down her carpet bag. After the cramped, noisy boarding house in La Veta, this small, clean room seemed like luxury. "You can rest a bit and get settled," Mrs. Davidson continued. "Then perhaps you can help me prepare the midday meal. The men come in from the morning work around noon." "Of course, Mrs. Davidson." The older woman paused, studying Violet's face. "You're running from something, aren't you, dear?" Violet stiffened, surprised by the direct question. Mrs. Davidson smiled gently. "Don't worry, I'm not prying. We all have our stories out here in the West. Robert and I came with nothing but hope and determination 30 years ago." She patted Violet's hand. "Whatever you're leaving behind, you're welcome here as long as you work hard and act honorably." Tears sprang unexpectedly to Violet's eyes at the simple kindness. "Thank you," she managed. "Rest a bit," Mrs. Davidson said. "I'll call you when I need help with the meal." Left alone, Violet sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by how swiftly her circumstances had changed. Yesterday, she had been a saloon girl facing an impossible choice. Today, she was a housekeeper on a respectable ranch, with honest work and a safe place to sleep. And it was all because of Thomas Jennings, a man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to voice. Over the next few days, Violet settled into life at the Davidson Ranch. The work was harder in some ways than the saloon, with long hours of cooking, cleaning, and laundry, but it was honest work that left her tired in body but peaceful in mind. Mrs. Davidson proved to be a fair and kind employer, patient with Violet's initial mistakes and generous with praise for her quick learning. She saw Thomas only at mealtimes, when the ranch hands would file into the large dining room adjacent to the kitchen for breakfast and dinner. Lunch was usually taken out in the fields, with Violet and Mrs. Davidson packing it in the morning. During those brief encounters, they exchanged few words, but Violet often caught Thomas watching her with a quiet intensity that made her both nervous and curious. The other ranch hands were mostly respectful, if curious about the new kitchen girl. A few of the younger ones made tentative overtures of friendship or something more, but Violet kept them at a polite distance. She had come here to escape that kind of attention, not to invite more of it. One evening, about a week after their arrival, Violet was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when Thomas approached, having just returned from a day of mending fences in the north pasture. "Miss Crawford," he greeted her, hat in hand. "How are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you, Mr. Jennings," she replied, securing a sheet to the line. "And you?" "Well enough," he said with a slight smile. "The work suits me." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Violet said, "I never properly thanked you for what you did. Bringing me here, giving me a chance at a new start." Thomas shook his head. "No thanks needed, you earned this position yourself." "Nevertheless," she insisted, "I am grateful, more than I can express." He nodded, accepting her gratitude. "Mrs. Davidson speaks highly of you. Says you're the best help she's had." Violet flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "She's been very kind. They both have." Another silence fell, more comfortable this time. Thomas seemed content to stand quietly while she continued hanging the laundry, the routine domestic task somehow more pleasant with his presence nearby. "I should let you get back to your work," he finally said. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." "I am," she assured him. "Better than I've been in a long time." He smiled a full smile this time that transformed his serious features and brought a warmth to his eyes that made Violet's heart beat a little faster. "I'm glad to hear it. Good evening, Miss Crawford." "Good evening, Mr. Jennings," she replied, watching as he walked back toward the bunkhouse, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. That night, as she lay in her small bed listening to the unfamiliar night sounds of the ranch, Violet found herself thinking of Thomas's smile and the way it had made her feel a fluttering sensation she hadn't experienced since she was a young girl with dreams of romance, untainted by the harsh realities of life. She told herself it was foolish. Thomas had helped her out of kindness, nothing more. And even if there was something more, she wasn't sure she was ready to trust again, to believe that a man might want her for herself rather than what she could provide. But as sleep finally claimed her, it was Thomas's steady blue eyes and rare smile that followed her into her dreams. The days passed, turning into weeks as spring fully established itself across the Colorado countryside. The aspen trees leafed out in vibrant green, and wildflowers carpeted the meadows surrounding the ranch. The cattle grew fat on the lush grass, and preparations for the spring drive to the railhead in Pueblo intensified. Violet found herself working harder than ever, helping Mrs. Davidson prepare provisions for the men who would be on the drive. There were biscuits to bake, beans to cook, coffee to grind, and jerky to prepare enough to last the 10-day journey. Despite the long hours, she found satisfaction in the work, taking pride in each task well done. Thomas, too, was busy from dawn until dusk, working with the cattle, mending tack and preparing for the drive. They saw each other rarely, and when they did, their interactions were brief but increasingly comfortable. A nod here, a smile there, occasional small talk about the weather or the day's work. 3 days before the drive was set to begin, disaster struck. Violet was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the next day's bread, when she heard shouts from the direction of the corrals. Looking out the window, she saw men running toward the north pasture, where a plume of smoke was rising. Mrs. Davidson burst into the kitchen, her face pale with worry. "Fire in the north pasture," she said tersely. "Robert and the men have gone to fight it." Violet's stomach clenched with fear. Spring fires could be devastating, especially with the recent dry spell they'd been experiencing. "What can I do to help? We'll need water and bandages ready," Mrs. Davidson replied, already moving to gather supplies. "And food for the men when they return." For the next several hours, Violet and Mrs. Davidson worked side by side, preparing for the worst while praying for the best. Occasionally, one of the younger ranch hands would ride in with news the fire was spreading. They were trying to create a fire break. The wind had shifted, pushing the flames toward the east. As dusk fell, the men began returning in groups, exhausted, smoke-stained, and some with minor burns. Violet helped tend to their injuries while Mrs. Davidson served food and coffee. With each group that arrived, Violet's eyes searched for Thomas, her anxiety growing when she didn't see him among them. Finally, Mr. Davidson returned with the last group of men. His face was grim as he accepted a cup of coffee from his wife. "We lost about 50 acres of grazing land," he reported, "and a few head of cattle, but we managed to contain it before it reached the timber or the main herd." "Thank God for that," Mrs. Davidson said. "Is everyone accounted for?" Davidson's expression grew more troubled. "Jennings and Miller are still out there. Last I saw, they were trying to free some cattle trapped by the flames in the northeast corner. I sent Parker back to check on them about an hour ago." Violet's hand trembled as she bandaged a young ranch hand's blistered palm. Thomas was still out there, possibly in danger. The thought terrified her more than she would have expected. As if summoned by her thoughts, the sound of horses approaching reached them. Violet hurried to the window to see Hank Miller, the foreman, riding in with another man supporting a third figure slumped in the saddle. Her heart seemed to stop when she recognized Thomas as the injured man. She rushed outside with Mrs. Davidson as the men carefully helped Thomas down from the horse. He was conscious but clearly in pain, his right arm and side badly burned, his face smudged with soot. "Got caught when the wind shifted," Miller explained grimly. "Went back for a trapped calf and got himself surrounded." If Parker hadn't found him when he did. He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. "Bring him inside," Mrs. Davidson commanded. "Violet, fetch my medicine box and fresh water." They settled Thomas on a cot in the dining room, carefully removing his charred shirt to reveal angry red burns across his right shoulder and side. He bore the pain stoically, only a tightening around his eyes betraying his suffering. "I'm sorry for the trouble," he managed to say as Mrs. Davidson began cleaning his wounds. "Hush now," she replied firmly. "Saving our cattle isn't trouble, it's your job, and from what Hank says, you did it well." Violet returned with the requested supplies, her heart aching at the sight of Thomas's injuries. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Hold his hand," Mrs. Davidson said practically. "This is going to hurt, and he'll need something to grip onto." Violet moved to Thomas's left side, taking his uninjured hand in hers. His fingers closed around hers immediately, his skin warm and calloused against her own. "I'm sorry," she whispered as Mrs. Davidson began applying a salve to the burns, causing him to tense in pain. "Nothing to be sorry for," he replied through gritted teeth, his eyes finding hers. "Just glad you're here." The simple statement, spoken in a moment of vulnerability, touched something deep within Violet. She held his gaze, offering silent support as Mrs. Davidson worked, her thumb unconsciously stroking the back of his hand in a soothing gesture. Later, after Thomas had been given laudanum for the pain and was resting comfortably, Mrs. Davidson pulled Violet aside. "He'll need careful tending for the next few days," she said. "The burns are serious but not life-threatening if infection doesn't set in. Robert says he can't possibly go on the cattle drive now." "Of course not," Violet agreed, glancing over at Thomas's sleeping form. "I'll help care for him." Mrs. Davidson studied her face with knowing eyes. "I've seen how you look at each other," she said gently. "Be careful with your heart, Violet, and his." Violet flushed, embarrassed that her feelings had been so transparent. "I don't know what you mean, Mrs. Davidson." The older woman smiled kindly. "Yes, you do, and there's no shame in it. Thomas Jennings is a good man, anyone can see that. Just be certain of your feelings before you act on them. Both of you deserve that much." With that cryptic advice, she left Violet alone with her thoughts and the sleeping Thomas. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Most of the ranch hands departed with Mr. Davidson for the cattle drive, leaving only a skeleton crew behind to manage the ranch. Thomas was moved to a small, unused room off the main house, where Violet and Mrs. Davidson could tend to him more easily. Violet found herself spending much of her time at his bedside changing bandages, applying Mrs. Davidson's healing salve, and helping him eat and drink. At first, he protested being fussed over, as he called it, but Violet was firm. "You helped me when I needed it," she reminded him. "Now let me help you." Gradually, as the pain lessened and his strength began to return, they talked more. Simple conversations about their childhoods, their dreams, the books they had read, the places they had seen. Violet found herself sharing stories she had never told anyone about her father teaching her to ride, her mother's beautiful singing voice, the small joys of her early life. Thomas, too, opened up, speaking of his parents' ranch in Texas, the pride he had felt working alongside his father, the devastation of losing it all during the war. He spoke of his years drifting from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to put down roots. "Why is that?" Violet asked one evening as she changed his bandages, the burns already beginning to heal under her careful ministrations. Thomas was silent for a moment before answering. After losing the ranch, home stopped feeling like something permanent, something you could count on. Seemed easier not to get too attached to any one place. "And now," she ventured. His eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. "Now I'm not so sure." The moment hung between them, charged with possibility, until Mrs. Davidson called from the kitchen, breaking the spell. As Thomas continued to heal, he began to move around more, joining them at the kitchen table for meals and even venturing outside to sit on the porch in the afternoon sun. Violet found herself looking forward to these quiet moments together, even as she reminded herself not to read too much into their growing closeness. One afternoon, about a week after the fire, Thomas was sitting on the porch when Violet brought him a cup of coffee. The spring day was perfect warm sunshine, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers, the distant mountains still capped with snow. "It's beautiful here," Thomas remarked as she sat beside him. "Peaceful." "Yes," she agreed. "I never thought I'd find such peace again." He turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "Violet, I've been meaning to ask you something." Her heart quickened at his use of her first name, something he had begun doing during his recovery. "Yes. When the cattle drive returns, I'll be expected to return to the bunkhouse," he said. "And once I'm fully healed, Mr. Davidson will want me back at regular duties." "Of course," she said, unsure where he was going with this. "What I mean is," he continued, a hint of nervousness in his usually confident demeanor, "our conversations will become less frequent. And I find I'm not looking forward to that prospect." Violet's breath caught. "I'm not either," she admitted softly. Thomas seemed encouraged by her response. "I know we haven't known each other long," he said, "but I feel as though I've known you for years. There's an ease between us that I've never experienced before." "I feel it too," she whispered. He reached out, tentatively taking her hand in his. "What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, is that I care for you, Violet, more than I expected to. More than I thought possible after such a short acquaintance." Violet looked down at their joined hands, his tanned and calloused from years of ranch work, hers smaller and paler, but beginning to show the marks of honest labor as well. "I care for you too, Thomas," she said, his name feeling right on her tongue. "But I'm afraid." "Of what?" of trusting too easily, of believing this can be real. She met his gaze, determined to be honest. My life before. It taught me that men's interest usually comes with expectations, demands. Understanding dawned in his eyes. I would never demand anything of you, Violet. Never. Whatever grows between us, if anything does, will be because we both choose it freely. The sincerity in his voice brought tears to her eyes. I believe you, she said. And that frightens me almost more than the alternative, because it means risking my heart again. Thomas gently squeezed her hand. We can take it slowly, he suggested. Get to know each other better before making any decisions about the future. Violet nodded, grateful for his understanding. I'd like that. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, their hands still joined, a tentative first step towards something neither had been looking for but both now found themselves wanting. The next 2 weeks passed in a comfortable routine. As Thomas's burns healed, he began helping with light chores around the ranch, still unable to return to full duties but no longer confined to the house. Violet continued her work with Mrs. Davidson, preparing meals, cleaning, and tending to the household needs. In the evenings, they would often sit together on the porch, talking quietly or sometimes just enjoying the silence and each other's company. Occasionally, Thomas would read aloud from one of the books in the Davidson small library, his deep voice bringing the stories to life as Violet worked on mending or simply listened. Mrs. Davidson watched their growing closeness with approving eyes, but maintained a discreet distance, giving them the space to discover each other without interference. The few remaining ranch hands were less subtle, exchanging knowing glances and good-natured teasing that made Violet blush, and Thomas adopt a stern expression that fooled no one. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Thomas turned to Violet with an unusually serious expression. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Something about my past that you should know before we go any further. Violet's heart fluttered at the implication that there was a further to go to, but she focused on his troubled expression. What is it? Thomas took a deep breath. During the war, I fought for the Confederacy, he said quietly. Not by choice. I was conscripted at 17, but I fought nonetheless. I don't hold with what we were fighting for, never did, but I still carry the guilt of the men I killed, the lives I helped destroy. Violet was silent, absorbing this revelation. The war had ended 11 years ago, but its shadows still lingered across the nation. After the war, Thomas continued, I couldn't go home, not just because our ranch was gone, but because I couldn't face my parents with what I'd done, what I'd become. His voice grew hoarse with emotion. I drifted west, trying to outrun my memories. For years, I never stayed in one place long enough to form connections. It seemed safer that way. And now, Violet asked softly. His eyes met hers, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. Now I'm tired of running, tired of being alone. Meeting you, it made me want to stop to see if I could build something lasting again. Violet reached for his hand, holding it tightly. Thank you for telling me, she said, for trusting me with this. I want there to be truth between us, he replied. Always. The word always hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Violet found herself wondering what it would be like to have an always with Thomas, a future stretching out before them, filled with quiet evenings like this one, with honest work and mutual respect, with love. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, it filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the day. I have truths too, she said after a moment. Things I'm not proud of, things I did to survive. You don't need to, Thomas began, but Violet shook her head. I want to, she insisted. Like you said, there should be truth between us. And so she told him about the desperate months after her mother's death, about arriving alone in Denver with no money and no prospects, about the progression from serving drinks to more, about the men she had entertained to keep a roof over her head and food in her stomach. She spoke without self-pity, but with unflinching honesty about the choices she had made and the toll they had taken on her spirit. Thomas listened without interruption, his hand steady in hers, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finally fell silent, emotionally drained but somehow lighter for having shared her burden, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Thank you," he said simply. "You're not disgusted?" she asked, her voice small, "by your courage?" "Your determination to survive," he shook his head. "Never. We all do what we must in this life, Violet. The measure of a person isn't in their mistakes or the hardships they've endured, but in how they face each new day." His words, spoken with such conviction, broke something open inside her, a dam of fear and shame she had carried for years. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not of sorrow but of release, of a burden finally shared and lightened. Thomas gently wiped away her tears with his thumb, his touch infinitely tender. "You are the bravest person I know," he said softly. "And if you'll allow it, I'd like to court you properly, to see if what's growing between us might become something more." Violet's heart soared at his words. "I'd like that too," she whispered. The moment seemed to call for more, perhaps a kiss to seal their new understanding, but they were interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Looking up, they saw a cloud of dust on the horizon that signaled the return of the cattle drive. "They're back early," Thomas remarked, rising to his feet. "Must have gotten a good price at the railhead and made good time on the return journey." Violet stood as well, smoothing her skirt with suddenly nervous hands. With the return of Mr. Davidson and the full complement of ranch hands, their quiet interlude was about to end. Thomas would return to the bunkhouse, and they would have to find new ways to continue what had begun during these peaceful weeks. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas caught her hand once more. "This doesn't change anything," he assured her. "What I said stands. I want to court you properly with Mr. Davidson's permission." The traditional approach surprised and touched her. "You would do that?" "Of course," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You deserve nothing less than respect, Violet. From me, from everyone." The riders were growing closer now, and Mrs. Davidson had emerged from the house to stand on the porch, shading her eyes as she watched for her husband. "We should go help them settle in," Violet said reluctantly. "They'll be hungry after the trail." Thomas nodded, releasing her hand but giving her a smile that promised more conversations to come. "Later," he said simply. The next few hours were a flurry of activity as the ranch hands returned, tired but in high spirits after a successful drive. Mr. Davidson reported a better-than-expected price for the cattle, putting the ranch in excellent financial position for the coming year, while Violet and Mrs. Davidson prepared a celebratory meal. Thomas helped the men settle the remaining cattle and tend to the horses. The dining room was rowdy that evening, filled with trail stories, laughter, and the satisfied exhaustion of a job well done. Violet moved among the men, serving food and refilling coffee cups, her eyes occasionally meeting Thomas's across the room. Each glance felt like a shared secret, a private understanding amid the communal celebration. After the meal, when the men had retired to the bunkhouse with full stomachs and the kitchen had been cleaned, Thomas approached Mr. Davidson, who was enjoying his pipe on the porch. Violet, helping Mrs. Davidson with final kitchen tasks, watched through the window, her heart pounding as she guessed the nature of their conversation. "Well, well," Mrs. Davidson said beside her, a smile in her voice. "It seems Thomas has found his courage." Violet turned to the older woman, her cheeks flushing. "You knew this would happen, didn't you? When you convinced Mr. Davidson to hire me." Mrs. Davidson's eyes twinkled. Let's just say I've lived long enough to recognize a good match when I see one. From the moment you two rode up together, there was something there, something worth nurturing." "But you couldn't have known that," Violet protested. "Perhaps not," Mrs. Davidson conceded, "but I knew you were a good soul in need of a chance just as he was. The rest, well." She smiled softly. "Some things are meant to be, even out here in the wilderness." Before Violet could respond, the door opened and both men entered. Mr. Davidson's expression was thoughtful as he looked between Thomas and Violet. "Miss Crawford," he said, "Mr. Jennings here has asked my permission to court you properly. As your employer and the closest thing to a guardian you have at present, I've given the matter some consideration." Violet held her breath, suddenly fearful. What if he refused? What if he decided a former saloon girl wasn't worthy of one of his ranch hands? "Thomas is a good man," Davidson continued. "Honest, hardworking, and from what I've seen these past weeks, genuinely concerned for your welfare. And you, Miss Crawford, have proven yourself to be a respectable young woman of fine character." He glanced at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. "Therefore, I am pleased to grant my permission for this courtship, provided you both continue to fulfill your duties to this ranch." Relief and joy flooded through Violet. "Thank you, Mr. Davidson," she said sincerely. "Yes, thank you, sir," Thomas added, standing straight and tall despite the bandages still visible beneath his shirt. Davidson nodded once, then turned to his wife. "Come, Martha. I believe these young people might appreciate a moment alone." With knowing smiles, the Davidsons retired to their bedroom, leaving Thomas and Violet standing in the kitchen, suddenly shy in the wake of this official sanction of their feelings. "Well," Thomas said finally, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "that went better than I expected." Violet couldn't help but laugh, the tension breaking. "What did you think he would say?" "I wasn't sure," Thomas admitted. "I'm just a hired hand with little to offer beyond my 2 hands and my word." "That's more than enough," Violet said softly. He moved closer, taking both her hands in his. "I meant what I said before, Violet. I want to do this right, to give you the respect and consideration you deserve." "And I meant what I said," she replied. "I want this too, Thomas, a chance to see where this leads." His eyes searched hers, and whatever he found there must have given him courage, because he slowly leaned forward. "May I?" he whispered. Violet's answer was to close the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was gentle and questioning at first, then deepening as they both gave themselves to the moment. It was nothing like the perfunctory kisses she had endured in her past. This was warm and sweet and full of promise, like the first page of a story yet to be written. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly uneven. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he confessed. "So have I," she admitted with a small laugh. He kissed her once more, briefly but tenderly, before reluctantly stepping back. "I should go. It's late and we both have early starts tomorrow." "Yes," she agreed, though part of her wished he could stay, simply to talk more, to be near him. At the door, he paused, looking back at her with an expression of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. "Good night, Violet. Sweet dreams." "Good night, Thomas," she replied softly, watching as he walked toward the bunkhouse, his steps lighter than she had ever seen them. As she prepared for bed that night, Violet touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope for happiness, for love, for a future that held more promise than her past had ever allowed her to imagine. Spring gave way to summer on the Davidson ranch, the days growing longer and hotter as the Colorado sun baked the landscape to a golden hue. With Thomas's burns fully healed, he had returned to his regular duties, often spending long days out with the cattle or mending fences in the far pastures. Despite their busy schedules, Thomas and Violet found time for their courtship. On Sundays, when the ranch observed a day of rest, they would often ride together to a nearby meadow where they would spread a blanket and share a simple picnic. Sometimes they talked for hours about their hopes and dreams. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, watching clouds drift across the vast blue sky. In the evenings, when work was done, they might walk along the creek that ran behind the ranch house, or sit on the porch swing that Mr. Davidson had built years ago for his wife. Their physical relationship progressed slowly, respectfully a held hand, an arm around a shoulder, increasingly confident kisses that spoke of deepening feelings. The ranch hands teased Thomas good-naturedly about his sweetheart, but there was no malice in it. If anything, the men seemed pleased to see their usually reserved colleague finding happiness. Mrs. Davidson watched over the courtship with maternal satisfaction, occasionally offering Violet gentle advice, or simply a listening ear when the young woman needed to sort through her feelings. As July turned to August, bringing with it the first hint of fall in the cooler evenings, Thomas began to grow thoughtful, sometimes distant. Violet noticed the change but didn't press, trusting that he would share his concerns when he was ready. That moment came on a Sunday afternoon as they sat beneath the shade of an old cottonwood tree near the creek. The day was still warm, but a gentle breeze made it pleasant, carrying the scent of late summer wildflowers. "I've been thinking," Thomas said after they had finished their simple meal of bread, cheese, and apples. "I've noticed," Violet replied with a small smile, "you've been very serious lately." He smiled back, though there was a nervousness to it that intrigued her. "Have I? I suppose I have." "What's on your mind, Thomas?" He took a deep breath, turning to face her fully. "The future, Violet. Our future." Her heart quickened at his words. Though their feelings for each other had grown obvious to everyone at the ranch, they had not spoken explicitly of long-term plans. "Mr. Davidson approached me last week," Thomas continued. "He offered me a new position as assistant foreman when Miller retires at the end of the season. It would mean more responsibility, better pay, and—" He hesitated, then pressed on, "a small cabin of my own on the property." "Thomas, that's wonderful," Violet exclaimed, genuinely pleased for him. "You've earned it." "It is," he agreed. "It's the kind of opportunity I've worked toward for years, but I told him I needed time to consider it." Violet's brow furrowed in confusion. "Why? It sounds perfect." "Because," he said softly, taking her hands in his, "I wouldn't want to accept it unless I knew you'd be there with me, in that cabin, as my wife." The world seemed to still around them as his words sank in. Violet stared at him, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Violet Crawford," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I love you. These past months have been the happiest of my life. You've shown me that it's possible to start again, to build something new even after carrying so many burdens." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that caught the sunlight. "This was my mother's. I've carried it with me all these years, the one thing I couldn't bring myself to part with, no matter how hard times got." He opened his palm to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center. "It's not fancy," he said apologetically, "but it's given with all my heart. Violet, will you marry me?" Tears filled Violet's eyes as emotions overwhelmed her joy, disbelief, and most of all, a deep, abiding love for the man before her who had saved her in more ways than one. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you." His face broke into a smile of such pure happiness that it took her breath away. With slightly trembling hands, he slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as if it had been made for her. "I love you, Thomas," she said, the words coming easily now that they had been spoken. "I never thought I could feel this way safe and cherished and whole." He drew her into his arms, his kiss filled with promise and passion and tenderness. When they finally parted, he kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I'll build us a good life," he promised. "It won't always be easy, ranch work never is, but we'll face it together. No more running for either of us." "No more running," she agreed, looking down at the ring that now symbolized a future she had once thought impossible. When they returned to the ranch house, hand in hand and glowing with happiness, Mrs. Davidson took one look at them and burst into tears of joy, hugging Violet fiercely before embracing Thomas as well. Mr. Davidson offered more reserved but equally heartfelt congratulations, along with a handshake for Thomas that turned into a brief, gruff hug. "I knew it the moment you rode in together," Mrs. Davidson kept saying, wiping at her eyes. "I just knew." News of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch. That evening, the hands organized an impromptu celebration, bringing out a fiddle and harmonica for music, breaking open a bottle of whiskey Mr. Davidson contributed for the occasion, and offering their own rough but sincere good wishes. As Violet stood in the circle of Thomas's arm, watching the ranch hands dance and celebrate as if the engagement were a personal triumph for each of them, she felt a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. This was what it meant to be part of a community, to be accepted and valued for who you were, not what you could provide. Later, as they stole a quiet moment together on the porch while the celebration continued inside, Thomas asked, "When would you like to be married?" "Soon," Violet replied without hesitation. "I don't need anything elaborate, just you and perhaps the Davidsons and the ranch hands as witnesses." Thomas smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The cabin won't be ready until October when Miller moves out. Would that be too long to wait?" "Not at all," she assured him. "It will give us time to prepare properly." "Prepare for what?" he teased. "I thought you didn't want anything elaborate." "Not for the wedding," she explained, a blush coloring her cheeks. For being a proper wife." Thomas's expression softened with understanding. "Violet," he said gently, "you don't need to worry about that. We'll figure it out together, just as we have everything else." His reassurance calmed the small flutter of anxiety she had been feeling. Despite her past, or perhaps because of it, the intimacy of marriage both thrilled and frightened her. But Thomas's patient understanding convinced her that this, too, would be different from anything she had experienced before, built on love and respect, rather than transaction or obligation. "October, then," she agreed, "when the leaves are turning and the air grows crisp." "October," he echoed, sealing the promise with a kiss. The following weeks passed in a flurry of activity. In addition to her regular duties, Violet now found herself preparing for a wedding and setting up a household. Mrs. Davidson proved an invaluable help, offering advice and practical assistance, even insisting on giving Violet several pieces of fine linen she had been saving for just such an occasion. The women of neighboring ranches, hearing of the engagement, organized a shower where they presented Violet with various household items: towels, dishcloths, a hand-stitched quilt, cooking utensils, and other necessities for setting up a home. The generosity overwhelmed Violet, who had grown accustomed to making do with very little. Thomas, meanwhile, spent his free time helping to prepare the cabin that would become their home. The small structure, situated about a quarter-mile from the main house, had been well built, but needed some repairs and improvements after years of bachelor occupancy. With help from some of the other hands, Thomas replaced broken window panes, fixed the sagging front step, built new shelves in the kitchen area, and gave the entire interior a fresh coat of whitewash. When not working on the cabin, he continued his ranch duties with renewed vigor, impressing Mr. Davidson with his dedication and skill. The promotion to assistant foreman was officially announced, to be effective after Miller's retirement in October, coinciding neatly with their wedding plans. As September arrived, Bringing the first golden touches to the aspen trees, Thomas approached Violet one evening with an unexpected proposal. "I've been thinking," he said as they sat on their favorite spot on the porch swing, "about your parents." Violet looked at him curiously. "What about them?" "You mentioned once that you never had a chance to visit their graves after you left Missouri," he said. "That you regretted not being able to say a proper goodbye." "Yes," she confirmed, surprised he had remembered that detail from one of their many conversations. "After my mother died on the journey west, I couldn't afford to go back." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "What would you think about going now, before our wedding? I've spoken with Mr. Davidson, and he's given me 2 weeks' leave. We could take the train to Missouri, visit your parents' graves, and perhaps see if any of your father's belongings might be recovered from whoever bought your family farm." Violet stared at him, speechless with emotion. The thought of returning to her childhood home, of properly honoring her parents' memory before beginning her new life with Thomas, it was a gift beyond measure. "You would do that for me," she finally managed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "For us," he corrected gently. "Your past is part of who you are, Violet, and who you are is the woman I love. I want to know everything about you to understand where you came from." The tears spilled over then, and Violet made no attempt to stop them. "Yes," she whispered. "I would like that very much." 2 days later, they boarded the train in Pueblo, beginning the long journey eastward. For Violet, who had not left the La Veta area in 3 years, the trip was both exciting and intimidating. Thomas, more accustomed to travel, guided her through the complexities of train schedules and connections with patient good humor. They traveled modestly but comfortably, Thomas insisting on purchasing proper sleeping car accommodations, despite Violet's protests about the expense. "We're using some of my cattle drive earnings," he explained. "I've been saving for years with no particular purpose. Now I have the best purpose imaginable, making you happy." The journey took 4 days, carrying them across the vast plains of eastern Colorado and Kansas, through the rolling hills of Missouri, and finally to the small town of Oak Ridge where Violet had spent her childhood. As they stepped off the train, Violet felt a strange combination of familiarity and disorientation. The town had changed in the years since she had left. New buildings had sprung up. Old ones had been renovated or replaced, yet the essential character remained the same. They checked into the small hotel on Main Street, taking separate rooms as propriety demanded, though they spent most of their waking hours together. That first afternoon, they visited the town cemetery where Violet's father had been buried 6 years earlier. Standing before the simple headstone, Violet placed the wildflowers they had gathered on the way. "Hello, Pa," she said softly, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back." Thomas stood slightly behind her, a supportive presence, but giving her the space to have this private moment with her father's memory. When she began to speak again, telling her father about her life, her trials, and finally her happiness with Thomas, he stepped forward to stand beside her, his hand warm and steady on her shoulder. "I wish you could have met him, Pa," Violet said. "You would have liked him, I think. He's strong and kind like you were." When she had said all she needed to say, they stood in silence for a few moments before Violet turned to Thomas with a sad smile. "Thank you for bringing me here." "You're welcome," he replied simply, understanding in his eyes. The following day, they set out for the Crawford family farm, located about 5 miles outside of town. Violet's stomach was in knots as they approached in the rented buggy, uncertain what reception they would receive from the new owners or what emotions seeing her childhood home might evoke. The farmhouse came into view around a bend in the road, a modest 2-story structure with a wide front porch, surrounded by fields of corn nearly ready for harvest. Violet's breath caught at the sight, memories flooding back of running through those same fields as a child, of helping her mother hang laundry on the line that still stretched between two posts in the side yard, of sitting on that porch with her father as he taught her to whittle. Thomas pulled the buggy to a halt at the gate, turning to Violet with concern in his eyes. "Are you all right? We don't have to do this if it's too difficult." She shook her head, squaring her shoulders. "No, I want to. I need to." As they approached the house, a woman emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Can I help you folks?" she called, her tone curious but not unwelcoming. "Good afternoon, madam," Thomas replied, removing his hat respectfully. "My name is Thomas Jennings, and this is Miss Violet Crawford. She grew up in this house before her family's. Circumstances changed. Recognition dawned in the woman's eyes. Crawford, John Crawford's daughter." When Violet nodded, the woman's face softened. "Well, bless my soul, I'm Mary Peterson. My husband Robert and I bought this place at auction after your father passed. Please come in, both of you." The interior of the house had changed considerably. New furniture, different curtains, walls repainted, but the basic layout remained the same. As Mrs. Peterson ushered them into the sitting room and bustled off to prepare tea, Violet stood in the center of the room, overwhelmed by the strangeness of being a guest in what had once been her home. "Your father was well respected in these parts," Mrs. Peterson said when she returned with the tea tray. "Everyone said it was a shame what happened to your family, the bank foreclosure and all." "Thank you," Violet said softly. "It's kind of you to remember him that way." "When we bought the place," Mrs. Peterson continued, "there were some personal items still in the attic. My Robert said we should keep them in case any family ever came back looking." She set down her teacup. "Would you like to see them?" Violet's eyes widened. "You kept my family's things. After all this time, didn't seem right to throw them out," Mrs. Peterson said simply. "Wait here." She disappeared upstairs, returning a few minutes later with a medium-sized wooden chest. "Here we are," she said, setting it down before Violet. "It's not much, I'm afraid, but it might mean something to you." With trembling hands, Violet opened the chest. Inside were exactly the kinds of personal treasures that would have been deemed worthless at auction, but were priceless to her. Her mother's Bible with family births and deaths recorded inside. A small collection of letters tied with faded ribbon. A daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. Her father's pocket watch that had stopped working years before his death, but that he had kept for sentimental reasons. A child's sampler that Violet herself had stitched under her mother's guidance. "I can't believe you saved these," Violet whispered, tears streaming down her face as she carefully examined each item. "Like I said, it seemed the right thing to do," Mrs. Peterson replied, her own eyes suspiciously bright. "Your father was a good neighbor to us before we bought this place. He helped my Robert when our well ran dry one summer, never asked for anything in return." Thomas, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Mrs. Peterson, your kindness means more than you can know. Violet and I are to be married next month and having these connections to her family. Well, it's a gift beyond price." Mrs. Peterson beamed at the news. "Married? How wonderful." She turned to Violet. "I'm so glad you found happiness, dear. Your father would be pleased." They stayed for nearly 2 hours, Violet sharing memories of growing up in the house while Mrs. Peterson told stories of the farm's recent history. By the time they left, with the precious chest secured in the buggy, Violet felt a sense of closure she had not expected to find. "How do you feel?" Thomas asked as they drove back toward town. "Lighter," Violet replied after a moment's reflection. "As if a weight I didn't realize I was carrying has been lifted." She looked at him, love welling up inside her. "Thank you for this, Thomas, for understanding how important it was without me having to explain." He reached over to take her hand, bringing it briefly to his lips. That's what love is, Violet. Seeing the needs of another's heart and trying to meet them, even before they're spoken. The remainder of their time in Missouri was spent visiting places from Violet's childhood, the school she had attended, the church where her family had worshipped, the small creek where she had learned to swim on hot summer days. Through it all, Thomas listened and observed, absorbing this part of Violet's history with genuine interest. They also visited her mother's grave, marked with a simple wooden cross in the same cemetery as her father. The site was neglected, the marker weathered by years of exposure. Before they left town, Thomas arranged for a proper headstone to be placed, matching the one on her father's grave. They should be remembered properly, he said when Violet protested the expense. They raised an extraordinary daughter that alone deserves commemoration. The journey back to Colorado was more lighthearted than the outward trip had been, both of them looking forward to their return to the ranch and the wedding that now lay only weeks away. The wooden chest of family mementos traveled with them, carefully stowed in the baggage car of the train. As the mountains of Colorado came into view on the final day of their journey, Violet felt a surge of emotion that surprised her. This wild, beautiful country had become home in a way she hadn't fully appreciated until returning to her birthplace. And the ranch, with its simple routines and honest work, had become the place where she had found not just safety but purpose and love. "It feels like we're going home," she remarked to Thomas as they watched the landscape change from the flat plains to the rising foothills. He squeezed her hand, understanding in his eyes. Yes, it does. Their return to the Davidson ranch was met with warm welcome, Mrs. Davidson insisting on hearing every detail of their journey over a specially prepared welcome dinner. The cabin was nearly ready, Miller having moved most of his belongings to the small house in town where he planned to spend his retirement. As October arrived, bringing with it the full glory of autumn in the mountains, final preparations for the wedding intensified. Mrs. Davidson insisted that Violet needed a proper wedding dress, not just her Sunday best, and set about altering one of her own daughter's dresses that had been carefully preserved in a trunk. The younger woman had moved to California years before and had given her blessing to the repurposing of the gown. "Every bride deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day," Mrs. Davidson declared as she worked on the alterations, adjusting the ivory silk to fit Violet's slimmer frame. The date was set for October 15th, chosen to allow time for final preparations, but before the unpredictable mountain weather turned too cold. Mr. Davidson had arranged for the circuit riding preacher to be present, adjusting his usual schedule to accommodate the ceremony. On the morning of her wedding day, Violet woke early, her mind a curious blend of calm certainty and nervous anticipation. As she washed and dressed in her undergarments, preparing for Mrs. Davidson's assistance with the wedding gown, she found herself thinking of how far she had come from that desperate day in La Veta when she had planned to flee with only $18 and a carpet bag. Now she was about to become Mrs. Thomas Jennings, with a home of her own, honest work, and a community that had accepted her as one of their own. It seemed almost too much good fortune for one person. A knock at her door interrupted her reflections. Mrs. Davidson entered, carrying the completed wedding dress, her face alight with excitement. "Are you ready, my dear?" she asked, laying the dress carefully across the bed. "Yes," Violet replied with absolute certainty. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The dress, when she put it on, was more beautiful than Violet had dared to imagine. The ivory silk complemented her fair complexion, and Mrs. Davidson had added delicate lace at the collar and cuffs that framed Violet's features perfectly. Her hair was arranged simply but elegantly, adorned with small white flowers from Mrs. Davidson's garden. "Oh my," Mrs. Davidson breathed when the preparations were complete, tears in her eyes. "You look absolutely beautiful, Violet. Thomas is a fortunate man." "I'm the fortunate one," Violet replied, emotion making her voice husky. A second knock at the door revealed Mr. Davidson, unusually formal in his Sunday suit, his gruff manner softened by the occasion. "It's time," he announced, then added with uncharacteristic sentimentality, "You look lovely, Miss Crawford. It's my honor to give you away today." The ceremony was to take place in the ranch's main garden, which had been decorated with autumn flowers and ribbons under Mrs. Davidson's direction. As Violet walked toward the gathering on Mr. Davidson's arm, she saw Thomas waiting for her beneath an arbor of twisted branches, handsome in a new suit he had purchased for the occasion. But it was his expression that took her breath away, the look of absolute wonder and love in his eyes as he watched her approach, as if he couldn't believe his good fortune. The ranch hands, scrubbed clean and awkward in their best clothes, stood as witnesses alongside the Davidsons and a few neighbors who had been invited. The preacher, a kindly older man with snow-white hair, smiled benevolently as Violet reached the arbor and took her place beside Thomas. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp October air, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, with traditional vows spoken in voices that grew stronger and more confident with each word. When Thomas slipped a plain gold band onto Violet's finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady, his eyes never leaving hers. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher finally declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. You may kiss your bride." Thomas took Violet's face gently between his hands, his eyes conveying all the love and promise he felt, before leaning in to seal their union with a tender kiss that held the perfect balance of reverence and passion. The small gathering erupted in cheers and applause, led enthusiastically by the ranch hands who had come to respect Thomas and adore Violet during their months at the ranch. The celebration that followed was joyous and unpretentious, a feast prepared by Mrs. Davidson with Violet's help in the days leading up, music provided by the ranch hands' fiddle and harmonica, dancing on the packed earth of the ranch yard as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mountains. As evening approached, Thomas sought out his bride, who had been engaged in conversation with one of the neighboring ranchers' wives. "Mrs. Jennings," he said, the new name bringing a smile to both their faces, "I believe it's time we retire to our new home." The traditional chivalry, a noisy, teasing escort of the newlyweds to their dwelling, was both embarrassing and touching. The ranch hands banging pots and pans and singing bawdy songs as they accompanied the couple to their cabin, before finally dispersing with good-natured laughter and final congratulations. Alone at last, Thomas lifted Violet over the threshold in the traditional manner, setting her gently on her feet in what was now their home. The cabin was simple but comfortable, with the main room serving as both kitchen and living area, a small bedroom through a door at the back, and a lean-to addition that housed a washroom. The furnishings were basic but solid: a table with 4 chairs, a small sofa before the stone fireplace, sturdy cabinets for dishes and food storage, a bed and dresser visible through the bedroom door. But what caught Violet's attention were the small touches that spoke of thoughtfulness: wildflowers in a mason jar on the table, new curtains at the windows, a gift from Mrs. Davidson, she suspected. And most touching of all, the wooden chest from her parents' home placed prominently in the living area, as if Thomas understood its importance to their new beginning. "Welcome home, Violet," Thomas said softly, standing behind her with his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. She turned in his arms, overwhelmed with love for this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. Home, she repeated, the word filled with meaning it had never held before. Our home. His kiss was different now, deeper, more urgent, yet still infused with the tenderness that had characterized their entire relationship. Violet responded in kind, her initial nervousness about this aspect of marriage dissolving in the warmth of genuine love and desire. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their new bedroom, Violet's head resting on Thomas's chest, his heart beat strong and steady beneath her ear, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, his fingers gently stroking her hair. "About how unlikely it all is," she replied honestly. "That I should find you or you should find me at exactly the moment when I had lost all hope. It seems almost like providence," he suggested when she hesitated. "Yes," she agreed. "As if someone was watching over us both, guiding us toward each other when we needed it most." Thomas was silent for a moment, considering. "I've never been a particularly religious man," he finally said, "but I can't help but think there was something more than chance at work. The way everything aligned, my arrival in La Veta on that particular night, overhearing your conversation with Wilkins, being in the right place at the right time to help when Simmons accosted you." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Whatever force brought us together, I'm grateful for it." "So am I," Violet murmured, sleep beginning to claim her. "So very grateful." As winter settled over the Colorado mountains, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a pristine wonderland, Violet and Thomas settled into the rhythms of married life. Their days were filled with work, Thomas rising before dawn to tend to ranch duties, Violet managing their household and assisting Mrs. Davidson with tasks in the main house, but their evenings were their own, spent in simple companionship before the fireplace. They discovered the small adjustments required when two independent people joined their lives. Thomas's tendency to leave his boots in the middle of the floor, Violet's habit of reading late into the night by lamplight, the negotiation of space and time that any marriage requires. But these minor frictions only serve to deepen their understanding of each other, their commitment to building a life together that accommodated both their needs. Christmas brought their first major celebration as a married couple, with Thomas surprising Violet with a set of silver hairbrushes she had admired in a catalog, and Violet presenting him with a new saddle blanket she had made in secret, embroidered with his initials. The Davidsons invited them to Christmas dinner at the main house, where gifts were exchanged and stories shared around a table laden with holiday fare. As winter gradually loosened its grip, and the first signs of spring began to appear, Violet made an important discovery. For several weeks, she had been feeling unusually tired, occasionally nauseous in the mornings. At first, she attributed it to a winter illness, but as the symptoms persisted, a different explanation suggested itself. One evening in late March, as she and Thomas sat before the fire, she gathered her courage to share her suspicion. "Thomas," she began, her voice slightly tremulous with excitement and nervousness, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the book he had been reading, immediately alert to the tone of her voice. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No," she assured him quickly. "Nothing's wrong. In fact, if I'm right, something is very, very right." She took a deep breath. "I believe I'm going to have a baby." "Our baby? In late summer or early fall?" Thomas stared at her for a moment, processing her words before his face transformed with a joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes. "A baby," he repeated, setting aside his book and moving to kneel before her chair. "Truly." Violet nodded, her own happiness mirroring his. "I'm fairly certain all the signs are there." He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach, awe in his expression. "A child," he said softly. "Our child." Looking up to meet her eyes, he asked, "Are you happy about this, Violet? Truly?" Happier than I ever thought possible, she assured him, covering his hand with her own. A little frightened too, I'll admit, but mostly just grateful for this new life we've created together. Thomas rose, pulling her up into his arms for a kiss that conveyed all the emotions words couldn't express. When they finally parted, he kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "You and our child. I'll spend every day making sure you both know that." The news of Violet's pregnancy was received with delight by the Davidsons, who immediately began making plans to help the young couple in ways that ranged from practical assistance to well-meaning but occasionally overwhelming advice. Mrs. Davidson, in particular, took it upon herself to ensure Violet was eating properly and not overexerting herself. Spring turned to summer, and as Violet's body changed to accommodate the growing life within, Thomas became, if possible, even more attentive and protective. He took on additional household chores without being asked, made sure Violet rested during the hottest part of the day, and spent evenings reading to her from books borrowed from the Davidsons' library. One night in August, as they sat on the small porch of their cabin watching a spectacular sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Violet felt the baby move a strong, definite kick that made her gasp in surprise. "What is it?" Thomas asked immediately, concern in his voice. "The baby," Violet replied, taking his hand and placing it where she had felt the movement. "Wait. There, did you feel that?" The wonder on Thomas's face as he felt his child move for the first time was something Violet knew she would remember all her days. That's our baby," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Yes," she agreed, covering his hand with hers. "Our baby." They sat in companionable silence as the sun completed its descent behind the mountains, the first stars beginning to appear in the deepening twilight. Violet's thoughts turned, as they often did in quiet moments, to the unlikely path that had brought them to this point. "I was thinking," she said after a while, "about the night we met, at the Silver Dollar Saloon." Thomas turned to look at her, curious. "What about it?" "You ordered water," she recalled with a small smile. "No one ever ordered water at the Silver Dollar," he chuckled at the memory. "I'd been riding all day in the dust. Water seemed the sensible choice." "It made you stand out," Violet continued. "That and the way you looked at me like you actually saw me, not just—" She hesitated. "Not just what was on offer," Thomas suggested gently. "Yes," she confirmed. "You were the first person in a long time who seemed to see past all that to the real me underneath." Thomas took her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles on her palm. "I saw a brave woman in a difficult situation, trying to maintain her dignity against considerable odds," he said. "I admired that immediately." "And I saw a man unlike any I'd encountered before," Violet replied. "Someone steady and honorable in a place where those qualities were rare." They fell silent again, each reflecting on that first meeting and all that had followed. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice thoughtful. "Do you ever regret it, leaving La Veta the way you did, taking a chance on a stranger?" "Never," Violet said without hesitation. "It was the best decision I ever made, the only decision, really, if I wanted any kind of future worth having." He nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. "I've been thinking," he said after another moment, "about names for the baby." "Oh." Violet responded, intrigued. They had discussed the possibility of names but hadn't settled on any. "If it's a boy," Thomas said, "I'd like to name him John, after your father, John Thomas Jennings." Tears sprang to Violet's eyes at the unexpected gesture. "And if it's a girl?" she asked, her voice husky with emotion. Thomas smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I was thinking perhaps Elizabeth, after my mother, Elizabeth Martha, to honor Mrs. Davidson as well." "They're perfect," Violet agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder as the night deepened around them, the future stretching before them full of promise and possibility. On a crisp September morning, after a labor that lasted through the night, Violet gave birth to a healthy baby boy. John Thomas Jennings entered the world with a lusty cry that immediately captured his father's heart. Thomas, who had paced anxiously outside during the delivery attended by Mrs. Davidson and the midwife from town, was called in to meet his son moments after the birth. The sight of Violet, exhausted but radiant, holding their child, was one Thomas would later describe as the most profound moment of his life. "I never knew it was possible to love two people so completely," he told her as he gently cradled his son for the first time. The first weeks of John's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights, feeding schedules, and the countless small adjustments required by a new addition to the family. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, rising without complaint for his share of night duties, and finding endless fascination in every tiny development in his son's growth. By John's first birthday, celebrated with a small gathering at the main house with the Davidsons and ranch hands in attendance, life had settled into a new normal. Violet had gradually resumed most of her duties, with John often accompanying her in a sling or basket as she went about her work. The baby was a favorite among the ranch hands, who competed for his smiles and vied for the honor of bouncing him on their knees. As John grew from infant to toddler, the Jennings family settled more deeply into ranch life. Thomas's position as assistant foreman brought increased responsibility, but also greater respect and better compensation. The small cabin was expanded with Thomas's own hands, adding a second bedroom for John and improvements to the kitchen that made Violet's work easier. In the spring following John's second birthday, Violet made another joyful announcement: a second child was on the way, expected in late fall. This pregnancy was easier than the first, her body seeming to know the path now, though Thomas remained just as attentive and protective as before. Elizabeth Martha Jennings arrived in November, a delicate girl with her mother's emerald eyes and a dusting of her father's sandy hair. John, now an energetic toddler, regarded his baby sister with a mixture of curiosity and proprietary pride, solemnly announcing to visitors, "My baby," whenever they came to see the new addition. Life continued its steady rhythm on the Davidson ranch as the years passed. The children grew, the seasons changed, and Thomas and Violet's love deepened and matured like fine wine. There were challenges, of course, harsh winters, occasional financial strain when cattle prices fell, childhood illnesses that brought sleepless nights of worry, but they faced each obstacle together, their partnership equal and strong. When John was 7 and Elizabeth 5, Mr. Davidson announced his intention to semi-retire, stepping back from daily management of the ranch while retaining ownership. Hank Miller had fully retired years before, and Thomas was the natural choice to take over as foreman. With the promotion came a further increase in salary, and most significantly, an offer from the Davidsons that would change their lives. "Martha and I have been talking," Mr. Davidson said one evening as the two families sat on the main house porch after dinner, the children playing in the yard under Mrs. Davidson's watchful eye. "We're getting older, and this place is too big for us to manage alone, even with help. We've no children of our own to leave it to." He looked directly at Thomas and Violet. "We'd like to offer you a partnership in the ranch. You continue managing operations as you have been, but as part owners rather than employees." Thomas and Violet exchanged stunned glances. "That's incredibly generous, Mr. Davidson," Thomas began, "but we couldn't possibly—" "It's not charity," Davidson interrupted gruffly. "It's good business sense. You two have helped make this ranch more profitable than it's ever been. You've earned this opportunity." "We draw up proper legal papers," Mrs. Davidson added. "You'd purchase your share of the ranch over time, using a portion of the profits. Eventually, when Robert and I are gone, you'd have the option to buy our remaining share from the estate. It was a path to full ownership of one of the most successful cattle operations in Colorado, a dream Thomas had never dared to entertain when he rode into La Veta all those years ago. A drifter with little more than his horse and the clothes on his back. After careful consideration and many discussions, Thomas and Violet accepted the Davidsons' offer. The partnership agreement was signed on a bright spring day, with John and Elizabeth solemnly witnessing what they only partly understood was a momentous occasion for their family. Life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. When Elizabeth was 8, Violet discovered she was pregnant once more, a surprise that brought both joy and trepidation given her somewhat advanced age for childbearing in that era. But the pregnancy progressed normally, and in due time she gave birth to another son, whom they named Robert Davidson Jennings in honor of their mentor and partner. The years brought changes to the wider world as well. The railroad expanded, bringing more settlers to the region. La Veta grew from a rough mining town to a more established community with proper schools, churches, and businesses. Occasionally, when Thomas had business in town, Violet would accompany him, never failing to experience a moment of disbelief when they passed the Silver Dollar Saloon, still operating though under new management after Wilkins had moved on to Denver. "It seems like another lifetime," she remarked once as they drove past the familiar building, "as if it happened to someone else entirely." "In a way it did," Thomas replied, understanding as always. "We're not the same people we were then." He was right, Violet reflected. The frightened, desperate saloon girl and the quiet, haunted drifter had been transformed by love, by purpose, by the family they had created together. They had found in each other not just companions for the journey but catalysts for becoming their best selves. When John turned 18, he announced his intention to attend the newly established agricultural college in Fort Collins, his mind set on bringing modern farming techniques back to the ranch. Elizabeth, always the scholar of the family, harbored dreams of becoming a teacher, while young Robert, still only 10, showed every sign of inheriting his father's natural affinity for cattle and horses. As Thomas and Violet watched their children grow and begin to find their own paths, they often marveled at the rich tapestry. Their lives had become so different from what either could have imagined on that fateful night in La Veta, when a saloon girl with nowhere to go met a cowboy who offered her a home and an honest life. On their 20th wedding anniversary, celebrated with a family dinner that included the now elderly Davidsons, Thomas presented Violet with a gift he had commissioned months earlier, a silver locket, to replace the simple one from her mother that had finally worn beyond repair. Inside, he had placed a tiny photograph of the two of them on their wedding day on one side and a current portrait of their 3 children on the other. "To remind you of our journey," he said as he fastened it around her neck, "from where we began to where we are now." Later that night, as they stood together on the porch of what was now their main house, the Davidsons having moved to the expanded cabin for easier management in their advancing years, Violet opened the locket once more, studying the images in the moonlight. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked softly. "That night in La Veta when you offered me a chance to leave, did you ever think we'd end up here?" Thomas considered the question seriously before answering. "I hoped," he finally said. "I couldn't have predicted the particulars, the children, the partnership, all of it, but I hoped we might find something genuine together. Something lasting." Violet closed the locket, letting it rest against her heart. "We found so much more than that," she said, leaning into his embrace as they gazed out at the ranch that had become their legacy. The home they had built together through love, persistence, and the courage to begin again when life had offered them each a second chance. And as the Colorado night wrapped around them, stars brilliant in the vast mountain sky, Violet Crawford Jennings knew with absolute certainty that the journey from that smoky saloon to this peaceful moment had been worth every step, every struggle, every leap of faith. For in Thomas's arms, she had found not just a home but a belonging so deep and true that it had transformed them both, healing old wounds and opening their hearts to a joy neither had believed possible until they found it in each other.